You sneaky, you're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
It's official, as you see there. Mark Carney is in, and he's about to have two more high-profile opponents.
Frontrunner Mark Carney.
Mark
Carney is the top pick to deal with U.S. President Donald Trump.
Carney was an economic record breaker.
Former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney secured more key cabinet endorsements in his campaign to become the next Liberal leader.
Candidates running to replace Justin Trudeau will go head-to-head tonight in the English language debate.
Now it's up to roughly 400,000 party members to choose a new leader as voting gets underway.
For the first time since 2021, the federal Liberals are leading against the Conservatives.
Has someone checked on Pierre Poilievre these days? Carney-mania is going around, folks, and I am worried it might have gotten him too. Because Carney has become the star of conservative attack ads.
Trump seizes on weakness, and nobody's weaker than Mark Carney. Carbon tax Carney. He's just like Justin. If Carney wins, Canada loses.
Mark Carney. I think I need to get used to saying that name now, because clearly he's got this Liberal leadership race in the bag. We'll find out March 9th if Mark's officially sticking around for the long haul. And then he's going to be the next prime minister, at least for a little while. And Carney's already hinted that if he wins, he'd be open to calling a general election immediately.
If it makes sense to get a strong mandate at that point, that is what will follow.
But winning the Liberal leadership is one thing. So far, he's been up against familiar, friendly, Liberal faces. Winning over the country, that is a whole different ballgame. He'd be going up against Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh, Yves-François Blanchet, Elizabeth May, and Maxime Bernier. And yes, these are all very different people with very, very different politics, but they've all got one thing in common. One thing that Mark doesn't. We know who they are. Polling in January by Abacus Data found that when shown a picture of Carney, 76% of Canadians had no idea who he was. So, who is Mark Carney? He's a banker. Sure, lived in the EU. Okay, he's good with numbers and money and math. He's an economics guy. And boy, is he ever.
We will need to build a strong economy, build a strong economy. Building a strong economy, we also need to build our economy. We need to build our economy right here. Building our economy, strength of our economy. Our economy, that's why we need big changes to how we're managing this economy. Laser focus on the economy, focus on the economy.
That was almost every time he said economy in the Liberal leadership debate. Almost. Some polls suggest that he could even outrun the Conservatives and snag the prime ministership right out of the hands of Pierre Poilievre. But if you're asking me, all of this sounds just a little bit familiar.
The Harris-Walz campaign coming to an end Wednesday with a concession speech from Vice President Kamala Harris. Democrats are now turning to each other. Some are pointing fingers, others simply baffled by the data that shows a clear failure to win over the voters they thought they had on their side.
Carney-mania. Is it real or seriously overblown? Is he Canada's Kamala Harris? Mild, overhyped, and fated to lose, or a serious contender? This episode, I'm talking to Luke Savage. He's been writing about politics and culture for places like The Jacobin, The Washington Post, and The Toronto Star for over a decade. And since the start of the Liberal leadership bid, he has been trying to diagnose what is behind Carney-mania. How a socially conscious banker became the man of the moment. And why he's not buying it. Let's get into it. Luke, thank you for making the time.
Cheers, it's good to be here.
So Carney-mania, is it real? Because people seem pretty interested in him. There's this general buzz in the air. For the first time since 2021, the Liberals are actually beating the Conservatives in one of a few polls. When I talk to people outside of work, they seem pretty interested in him, but then they also kind of admit that they have no idea who this guy really is. So how is he managing to connect with people who have no clue who he is.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of whether it's real or not, I kind of have more questions than I do definitive answers here. Clearly, as you alluded to already, there's something happening here because the Tories have enjoyed, these massive leads in the polls, double digits, 25, 30 points, whatever, in the polls for the last 2 years or so. And I believe it was yesterday I saw there's at least 4 major polling companies that now have basically a statistical tie or even, have the Liberals slightly ahead. So something's happening here. To some extent, it may have to do with Mark Carney for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. I think we can't, underestimate the significance of just Justin Trudeau's departure. I think there's no getting around the fact that he was he'd become anyway a very unpopular figure. No one was really expecting him to go. And furthermore, the Liberal brand, such as it is since 2013, has been really heavily invested just in the personality of Trudeau himself. So you take that away, and I think the Liberal brand itself reverts to something else, which is a sort of, catch-all signifier that probably a majority of the electorate, it has at least a benign, if not a positive connotation to a majority of the electorate. You also, of course, have the tariff threats from Trump and the annexationist rhetoric. And I just think that, Carney himself notwithstanding, that itself just, I think, undermines the narrative the Conservatives, or undermines the political or electoral effectiveness of the narrative the Conservatives have been running on, because they've been planning to fight a cost of living election. They've been, their electoral calculus has presumed a sort of throw the bums out sentiment was going to be the dominant one. And right now, I think the dominant sentiment is more like confusion, anxiety, fear, craving for stability, et cetera, et cetera. And I think those conditions are much more conducive to a figure like Carney, even if, as you said, it's not clear the extent to which people actually know him, at least in any level of detail.
Why so? Why does this work in his favor? Because it's interesting for me to compare this kind of boring, mild, tepid banker to the sunny ways, charismatic, weed-loving Trudeau almost a decade ago. If he ran against Trudeau then, I'm not sure he would meet the moment then. But it seems to be working in his favor here. Why? Why is this working?
I mean, I think periods of instability, uncertainty, anxiety often just create a yearning for sort of bland figures. This isn't a perfect comparison, but if we think back to the 2020 U.S. election, where you had this Democratic primary where you had a lot of younger candidates, you also had, an avowedly, populist left candidate in the figure of Bernie Sanders. The figure that won was the most boring, kind of insipid, this figure who first entered politics during the presidency of Richard Nixon. And I really think a lot of Joe Biden's appeal was that a lot of people just thought, I just want politics to go away. I don't want to have to be on Twitter freaking out about the news all the time. I don't want all the people I watch on MSNBC to be scared all the time. And, you compare that to 2008 with the Obama thing, or, in a similar vein to our own election here in 2015, the conditions are different. The personal appeals of different kinds of figures are different. And I think much the same thing is going on here.
There are two kinds of people, the people who know who he is and are attracted by that, and the people who don't know who he is. He's kind of this political cipher, this blank slate. Maybe talk to me a bit about that.
Sure. Well, I think, something distinct about Carney. I mean, he's been someone I've been aware of since, I would say, probably 2009, 2010, which is kind of strange in and of itself because, he's not someone who's ever had elected office, but he has been a kind of a public figure. And I think he's been pretty savvy at kind of cultivating this image as, a socially conscientious banker. For example, in 2011, he gave an interview where he was talking about Occupy Wall Street, and he basically said, these protests are, a constructive response to global inequality. He addressed the Canadian Auto Workers Convention, I think in 2012, 2013.
And I want to discuss today what we can do to build the foundations for the right kind of globalization so that you can concentrate on creating prosperity for your families and for fellow Canadians.
So this is not the behavior. This is not the type of visibility that somebody with his background, somebody who's brushed shoulders at Goldman Sachs and, been a governor of 2 national central banks. We're not usually. This isn't the kind of image such a person generally has, and I think that's made Carney, or it's helped him become, a very useful cipher figure.
What's a political cipher? Just give me an example of that.
I think the ultimate political cipher, and by far the most skillful one, at least in the 21st century, is Barack Obama. I reviewed the first volume of his memoirs, A Promised Land, a few years ago. I've also read his other 2 memoirs, and I mean, what he does in those books is absolutely extraordinary. He manages to graft virtually everything, cultural, historical, artistic, political, like everything he manages to graft onto his own autobiography. Every space that he describes is always this perfect cornucopia of American society. It's like every sexual orientation, every racial identity, every class background, all of them are represented, and all of them are kind of realized in the figure of Barack Obama. And it continues today in the lists that he releases of,
his favorite
songs, his favorite.
God.
Even if you like, the lists themselves are always perfectly balanced in kind of like the tastes and the high, the low, the middle, all of it. But even sometimes just the individual examples. I think it was in 2020 where one of the things on his playlist was a version of it was Aretha Franklin covering the band's The Weight with Dwayne Allman from the Allman Brothers on guitar. So just right there, it's like this perfect collage of heartland sounds, right? This like perfect multiracial rendering of this American classic. That is what it means to be a cipher, and no one does it better than Barack Obama.
You think Mark has some of this as well, Mark Carney?
I mean, he has the infinitely more boring and less compelling version of it. If you kind of come from his world and or you're somebody of a kind of fiscal conservative proclivity or something like that, you recognize this as, this is one of our own. This is not a guy who's going to rock the boat too much. He's not going to tax capital gains. I mean, we know that for sure. we know that because he's told us. But then, if you're, just a middle-class reader of the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or something, you're somebody who follows the news, you've probably come across his book that came out in the last couple of years, Values. Even if you didn't read it, you probably read a review of it, and, it's and a lot of the sentiments in it sound kind of high-minded and progressive and that sort of thing. You might remember his comments about Occupy Wall Street. So even if you don't really know him very deeply, there's kind of a faintly positive association there. I mean, I'll confess, as somebody who has known about him for a long time, I didn't really know what his voice sounded like until he entered the race.
Sounds pretty banker-like.
Right, exactly. I think that's allowed him to, at least for the time being, occupy a space where he can sort of be, in this particular moment, whatever exactly it is you want him or need to be.
I want to talk a little bit about this centrist crowd, this fiscally conservative crowd. I watched the English Liberal leadership debate. It wasn't there weren't a lot of fireworks, but it felt like Carney was speaking directly to that fiscally conservative, that centrist crowd.
And one thing you can see is that the scale of increase in spending and the scale of increase in the public service hasn't been matched by greater productivity in certain areas.
And it feels like his game plan so far is kind of abandoning the left. Do you feel like this is an effective tactic, like finding a home in this murky center?
I mean, I'm glad you brought up the debate because the tack he's taken there, and frankly, the tack he's taken since the start of his leadership campaign has kind of surprised me. I think Liberals, whether it's here in Ontario or federally, I think they tend to do better when they're seen at least to occupy the progressive part of the political spectrum or be anchored there as most people understand it.
Do you feel like Justin Trudeau was like that?
I mean, I don't think that he authentically was, but I certainly think that he was perceived that way, and I think that was absolutely critical to the Liberal victory in 2015. Carney has not staked out that ground really at all. I mean, yeah, he made those pretty bizarre comments about the far left. I wasn't even really sure what exactly he was referring to there. And in the debate, which I'm so glad you brought it up. I mean, some of the most soporific television I think I've ever seen, although I think it was actually slightly more exciting than the French debate the night before. But I was really struck by, Carney's performance. I think Chrystia Freeland's as well. Just in how narrow a constituency they seem to be speaking to. They did not actually seem to be speaking to a kind of general audience, or at least I didn't think so. They were dealing, Carney and Freeland especially were dealing, they were drawing from a very kind of technocratic lexicon.
I felt like I was sitting in a lecture.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere between a lecture and a job interview, because they kept talking about, it was all this HR stuff about, well, I've run a business and I've managed an economy and this kind of stuff. Productivity.
We have to increase productivity going forward. Productivity in government, as Frank just says, I won't go on about it, huge productivity.
I mean, productivity, this is an example of where Carney's, technocratic impulses, I think, really risk tripping him up, making him vulnerable to the Conservatives and to the NDP as well.
Can you tell me what a technocrat is?
It's an approach to politics, which is basically politics is just kind of management of a business, basically. It's all about, spreadsheets and algorithms and kind of administrative complexity. When he tried to raise the issue of productivity, he kind of made it sound like the problem is that people aren't working hard enough.
Yeah.
Hannah Thibodeau, the host, asked them a question about record food bank use. And Carney began by talking about how he wants to eliminate the GST for first-time home buyers because, as we all know, people who are lining up at food banks are just like a small sales tax cut away from being able to buy a $1.5 million home.
Totally. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Carney was talking about food prices, and I'm forgetting the exact metric. The basket of goods. Thank you.
So we've had the average family of four. Their food basket has gone up by more than 25%. Their wages haven't kept pace with that.
Yeah, it was very much not dealing in, a language that is, the way most people relate to politics or, I don't know, their own, experience of their lives or the cost of living crisis. I mean, I did think, Karina Gould at one point was trying to sort of bring it back there.
When my colleagues talk about households, I talk about families. When they talk about, the macro picture, I talk about what it means for individuals.
It really did not seem like Carney or Freeland, that's just not the way that they think about politics. It's not the way they discuss it. They do kind of think about it and discuss it at the level of these official metrics and abstractions. It's all very sort of Globe and Mail business section. And actually, watching Carney the other night was the first time I really thought, I'm not so certain after watching that this is going to work.
There's an affordability crisis. There's a housing crisis, an immigration crisis, a drug crisis. There's mass polarization. I wonder if he's really able to convince people that he's not just the solution to one thing, that being the economy.
The cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. And I think if you can't talk to people like a human, if you're unable to signal even superficially that, you are connecting to their, actual experience on some level, less abstract than I don't know, the debt to GDP ratio or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that really creates problems for any politician, regardless of the environment. We've seen Canadian nationalism and economic nationalism of a kind come back with a vengeance. Since Trump started making these threats. But the kinds of solutions, the kind of responses that are being tossed out by most of our political mainstream, and this isn't just Carney, I'm not sure that a few months or even a few weeks from now, I'm not sure these are the kinds of things that you're really going to be able to run on in an election or are going to have much electoral appeal. An east-west pipeline, for example.
I would convene, as part of First Minister's discussion of the projects of national interest, which would include both clean and conventional energy, would include pipelines, getting consensus around those projects.
I'm not sure there's a big popular constituency outside of that, even if there is like a business constituency for it. And, even if that is something you like and want, it's probably going to take 10 or 15 years. And because of all the jurisdictional issues and because of the complexities of Canadian federalism, it might not happen at all.
I think it's easy for Carney to convert ex-liberals who were basically just looking for an excuse not to vote for Pierre Poilievre. But do you think he could actually bring someone back that feels seriously jaded by the Liberal Party?
My instinct is to say no. David Coletto at Abacus published a piece. He basically found an underlying trend in the overall one we're seeing in the polls, where it looks like older voters, boomers especially, who'd been planning to vote Conservative, are moving back to the Liberals, and that certainly doesn't suggest that the Liberal resurgence in the polls has much to do with bringing back, I don't know, people who are seriously jaded anyway. I think it's bringing back older voters, probably in suburbs, probably in parts of the GTA that are the big liberal conservative battlegrounds in elections. It's too early to tell if it's going to go beyond that, but it would certainly surprise me.
Part of me feels like this is all sounding a bit familiar. Isn't this what happened in the U.S., that this late-to-the-game candidate who seems like a viable alternative, someone who isn't drastically shaking things up in a big way, who was somehow related or is semi-related to who was in power before, is Carney our Kamala Harris?
I think his political instincts, such as they are maybe a little bit sharper than Kamala Harris's. I mean, I think if she'd have played things a little bit differently, she probably could. Well, she definitely could have won that election. But I also think there's a clear difference between the two of them, in as much as Kamala Harris was Joe Biden's vice president, right? So she was directly attached to that administration. And all that was hated about it. Carney doesn't have that problem, right? Chrystia Freeland, however, it really seems like she does have that problem. And I mean, we haven't talked about her much, but I think it's been really striking just in the past 7 or 8 weeks how many kind of different narratives she's cycled through, going into and through her leadership campaign. When she quit cabinet, she was kind of staking out this ground as, the government's being fiscally imprudent. I can't sign on to this. And then as soon as Carney got into the race, she started talking about how Carney is the PMO's candidate. I'm an outsider, and I'm running against the Ottawa establishment, which is just as rich as Carney, calling himself an outsider when he's comes from the world of hedge funds and central banks and that kind of stuff. Carney doesn't really have the same albatross on his neck. Not only was he not really associated with Justin Trudeau, there aren't like a zillion photos of them together as there were with Chrystia Freeland, who's someone who I think her whole image has, or the rise of her whole public image has run parallel to her relationship with Justin Trudeau. I mean, Carney not only doesn't have to deal with that, but prior to, January or maybe December, to be generous, he's basically just there's just blank space in terms of what people know about him.
We kind of were talking earlier about how Carney's positioning himself in this murky center, this almost like conservative light. Karina Gold said that multiple times on that Liberal leadership debate stage.
And the way that we're going to bring young people back to the party is not by being conservative light and not by being unambitious for Canada. We will only win the next election by being Liberals, proudly, not conservative light.
Isn't that kind of what Kamala Harris was doing? Abandoning the left, positioning herself somewhere kind of in the middle where you don't, like in this murky center. Isn't that what he's doing as well, though?
I think there are some stylistic differences. I mean, one thing that Kamala Harris was doing, and I mean, worth saying here that, the United States in, 2024 is a different environment politically, electorally, culturally than Canada is. A lot of the stuff she was doing was, that was really ineffective was, she was surrounding herself with celebrities. She was doing a lot of stuff that was incredibly weird, like, campaigning with Liz Cheney, sort of trying to bring over that whole Never Trump constituency. Multiple interviews where Kamala Harris was talking about how much she loves guns.
Oh my God,
and that kind of thing.
What kind of gun do you own, and when and why did you get it?
I have a Glock, and I've had it for quite some time.
Democrats were, they were getting in on, deportation stuff. I mean, they're still doing that, talking about how, actually Biden deported way more people than Trump did in his first, few weeks in office. And actually, that's good. It's like, okay. But Carney, I think, is doing something a little different. I think he's absolutely trying to occupy this sort of, mushy catch-all center ground.
Yeah, and we don't even know where he stands on a lot of these, like, what you would consider like social progressive issues. Like, he hasn't really talked much about that. He's talked a lot about the economy, but nothing else. Like, I think, again, this comes back to what you were saying, that like the fact that we don't know much, that he's a blank slate, he's this political cipher, is working in his favor here.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the test for Carney and for people like him is how long can you sustain that? And is there more eyeballs on you as you're dealing? As you're in contexts that are more adversarial. Which these two Liberal debates, most certainly were not. I mean, it's actually worth another comment on that. I mean, I thought it was striking how after in the press scrum, reporters kept asking Karina Gould about, you were really confrontational. And it's like, having just watched the debate, I thought, like, not really. I mean, she was confrontational in the sense that, like, it's a debate. And in a debate, you're supposed to disagree and draw contrasts with other people.
I mean, she just name dropped him. Like, that's kind of all. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah, and, mild disagreements about, the pace of military spending over the next few years.
Mark, you talked about reaching NATO targets, but of all of us on stage, you plan to reach those not until 2030, but the imperative to do that is now.
Not exactly firebrand stuff.
Yeah, tell me, after watching that debate, after seeing over a year of Pierre Poilievre trying to run for prime minister, his campaign, how do you think he'll hold up Mark Carney against Pierre Poilievre?
It's difficult to answer that question, and I think the reason is that I'm actually still not really sure what the Conservatives are doing here. They had this supposedly big rally. There was certainly a lot of hype around it. This was kind of supposed to be their reorientation, their big nationalist pivot. I heard a lot about that in the lead up to it. I didn't really hear a lot about it at all after it happened, and I think they're still very much recalibrating. In theory, it should be pretty easy for them, and it should be pretty easy for the NDP as well to go after Carney for his. I mean, he is a Davos guy, right? If you're someone who's on the left, there are obvious problems with that, and if you're a Poilievre supporter, I mean, that's that's the World Economic Forum, right? That's globalism. That's all the stuff that you don't like.
I just remembered something last night. I was scrolling through TikTok and I saw this guy. He had all the pictures of the Liberal Party leadership candidates, and it was like Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, Karina Gould, and Frank Baylis.
These are the Liberal Party candidates if they were American politicians. Chrystia Freeland is basically Canadian Kamala. Her number one guy was doing terribly. She was there the whole time. Now she's like, oh, no, I'm not that. I'm different. Karina Gold, which is like AOC if she was Canadian, means well, too young to really make a difference. Frank Bayless, who's like a Kevin O'Leary type, but just not as popular. I think he's just trying to get on Dragon's Den. You have Ruby Dalla, who is basically Caitlyn Jenner if she ran as a Democrat, and equally always have the wrong amount of eyeshadow on, who's now been kicked out. And there's Mark Carney, who's probably going to win this, who's just like a guy. He's a guy.
I don't even know who this guy is. This guy's just a dude. And I think it's just like a perfect encapsulation of like how a lot of people feel about him.
He is a blank slate. And I think, it's going to be very interesting to see how that slate is filled in, how that blank space is filled in people's minds over, the next few weeks and months. I think that is really what's going to determine Mark Carney's future.
Luke, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for sticking around. If you like this video, hit the like button, leave a comment. I love the comment section. And subscribe. Also hit that little bell button to make sure that you are up to date with all the videos that come out on this channel. Thanks for listening. I'm so stuck. Yeah, this is really attractive. Oh my God, I've never stretched that way before. The things I do for this pod.